Good evening. My name is Willie Poinsett, and I'm the founder and president of Respond to Racism, and we welcome you here tonight. Before we get on with our program, I'm going to ask that you have 1 minute of quiet reflection for the tragedies from this past month and also in this month. While some of us feel hopeless, we cannot give up on hope. So for humanity and to exist in harmony, let's do a moment of silence. Thank you. Today, I would like to honor the original inhabitants whose lands we live on. The Efalati, Kalapunya, Chinookans. We are learning about each other's cultures and lived experiences. The work that we're doing in Respond to Racism community gives us a better education of each other's history and cultures, and gives us the tools to erase all of the isms. Ultimately, the dominant stories and expectations will shift, ushering in a new era of equality or equity, respect and empowerment for Native peoples, as well as a richer and stronger society for all people in the United States. Tonight, we'll like to read our mission and our meeting goals. Our mission is to educate and empower Lake Oswego residents and institutions with the tools to combat racism in all of its forms and make LO and Oregon a better place to live for the residents of all races and ethnicities. And we have some agreements and some expected outcomes. Our agreements: be brave, share ideas, ask questions, and engage in the conversation. Let others speak, respectfully listen to understand, and be open to new ideas. Share your unique perspective and speak honestly. Critique ideas, not people. Ask clarifying questions and respect each other's thinking and value their contributions. Honor confidentiality. Our expected outcomes: we'll get acquainted with who's in the room and wanting to respond to racism in LO. We won't solve racism in 2 hours. You'll leave the meeting with more questions than you came with. You'll have one actionable item, and you'll have more ideas of how you can interrupt racism. I want to just say thank you to and acknowledge some people. Last community meeting speaker, T.M. Garrett, Catherine Phelps, Our story time reader, coordinator, the one that just gets our young people excited about stories. Our silent walk and all of those who help with them and assist. Our proud sponsor, we are proud to have sponsored 2 Asian American Pacific Islander heritage celebrations. The city of Lake Oswego, in collaboration with LO for Love, and the Asian American Student Union of Lake Oswego. And so we co-sponsored those events. And Jeremy, who is our treasurer, is going to be coming forth. But while he's getting ready, I want to thank you for all of you, the donors. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Jeremy?
Yes, I am Jeremy, and I am the treasurer for Respond to Racism. I've been doing this since September, I believe. I got more involved in this organization. And I just wanted to say thank you to all of you who support us. And also, I wanted to say that as the treasurer, I have a very privileged position in this organization, that I get to see so much that happens that Willie, has already mentioned today, and so many other things that go without mentioning, things that happen beyond the community meetings and the Youth Empowerment Council and the Children's Story Time and some of the more visible events. But I get to see all of it because money touches everything. And because as the treasurer, I'm invited on the leadership team and on the board, and I get to see how much volunteers are doing out in the communities and all the different ways that we are out there, spreading awareness, spreading our message, encouraging, empowering people, interrupting wherever we see injustice happening and racism happening in our community. And I think you would be surprised too, just to know how much time our volunteers spend at networking with people and just being aware of what happens at city council, school board meetings, the library, at all sorts of community events, just so we can be aware and we can point, we can speak truth, and we can empower people to be a better community. And as we now come upon our 5-year anniversary, I just wanted to say thank you to all of you who give money. That's what has allowed us to grow to the organization that we are today. And we have big dreams of expanding our organization thanks to you. And so I wanted to make sure everyone who is here knows how to give to Respond to Racism. As many of you know, Lake Oswego United Church of Christ used to house us. We became our own 501c3, and now we are doing all of our own managing of our funds. They asked us to take that over just in November. So now all donations come directly to us, and I want to make sure everyone knows how to do that. The easiest way is you can just go to your bank. If you pay bills online, just enter our address in your bill pay section, and you can set up recurring donations or one-time donations. All you need to know is our name, Respond to Racism. You can just put RTR, it'll get to us. PO Box 1290, and we're at the 97035 post office. And that's the easiest way to donate to us. Your bank will just send us a check, and there are no fees taken out. And so 100% of your money goes to the work of this organization. We also have a Square donation site, and you can access that just through our website. Go to our website, scroll down a little bit, you can see one-time donation or recurring donation. Just click that link, it'll take you to our Square site where you can give with a credit card or a debit card. At the end of the year, we will send you a receipt showing everything that you gave to us so you can deduct it on your taxes. And I'm going to go ahead and put my email address in the chat as well. I'm always available if anyone has any questions about donations or anything related to the finances of Respond to Racism. I am here. So thank you again for your support. Not only are you the bedrock that allows us to do everything that we do, but when we sit in these meetings with the leadership team or the board, we know that we have the community behind us, supporting us in meaningful ways and allowing us to continue interrupting racism wherever we see it in our community and beyond. So thank you very much. And I am supposed to turn it over to Pat, who is going to talk next, I believe.
Thank you, Jeremy. With that said, thank you. John is going to be putting up a poll. We just wanted to know how you heard about the meeting tonight. We're kind of really working on our social media and our advertisements. So the best that we know how you learned about the meeting, that would be very helpful. So we'll just give you just a few seconds.
I think I may have messed up your poll. I was trying to close it off of my screen, and I think I may have accidentally stopped it. And so we may have to relaunch it. I'm sorry. I didn't want to respond to the poll, and so I tried to close it, but sorry.
I was wondering why I was stuck at 6. John, can you put it back up or not?
I think I can actually restart it, but it'll start from 0. Oh, there it goes. Sorry about that, guys.
Okay, I'm glad you have poll skills. Oh, well, look at that, Ava. It's great. Okay, thank you for responding to poll number 1. We'll just give you a few seconds so we know how our social media advertising is going. Okay, we have 51 people who responded, so that's great. So we're going to end that poll, and then we're putting up another poll. The second poll is reflective of the last meeting. The question is going to be, did you take at least one of those actions that was proposed at the last meeting, which was, did you participate in the discussion book group, Inner Work for Racial Justice, that was recommended, and also T.M. Garrett, who spoke as a speaker last week. He was encouraging to have a conversation with someone who has opposing views on racism. And that was quite a challenge for our community. So it would be interesting to see your responses at this point. Okay, we'll give you about 15 more seconds. Okay, thank you for that. As you know, the work that we are doing with Response to Racism takes a lot of inner work, and participating in the book group has been very helpful for those who have joined us. And we know that the work of having a conversation with people is quite a challenge and also requires lots of work as well. So thank you for that. Tonight, some of you have already met Ava as part of the poll. We're so excited to have her here tonight to join us. Some of her have already listened to her at another session, so we are very grateful that she's able to share her information tonight. Ava Gugamos is an activist and an associate professor at Pacific University here in Oregon. She has an MA in history from Yale University, a Master of Library Science from Simmons University, and a BA from the University of Kansas. At Pacific, she oversees the archives and museum collections. She has been researching the history of the Forest Grove Indian School for 10 years and recently published a website documenting deaths and burials of children at the Chimawa Indian School. So thank you, Ava, for joining us. And this is your show tonight.
Thank you very much, Pat. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. I have a lot of different images and things to show you all. So just one second while I get that on the screen. And Pat, if you might, and others, if you might be able to mute yourselves, that would be great. Thanks. All right. So thank you all for inviting me. Really honored to be able to talk with you all. I'm going to be speaking tonight about a pretty heavy topic, which is the Native American residential school system in Oregon. This is a system that took children away from Native families for generations. So it is a pretty heavy topic. And I just want to warn everyone of that up front. I also wanted to just mention that I'm really glad to see this work being done, and just the outline of what your organization is doing is really moving to me. My husband lived in Lake Oswego many years ago. He had an aunt and uncle who lived there, so I've visited Lake Oswego before, a beautiful place. Anyway, just glad to see this community outreach being done. All right, so before I get started with the meat of the talk, I like to start out just saying a few words about why it's me up here talking to you. This isn't about me, of course, but one thing I've learned from listening to and talking with Native communities over the last few years is that it's important to start out by explaining yourself and saying a little bit about, you know, who you are if you're the one speaking and how you're connected to the story that you're telling. So even though this talk isn't about me, I'm just going to say a couple of words about my background. Firstly, I'm not Native, so I'm not coming to you as like a representative of a tribe or a representative of survivor communities. Just about all of my ancestors were Western Europeans. My earliest ancestors in America came to New England in the 1600s, and branches of the family lived, you know, all over the United States. And so my family was certainly among those who were doing the colonizing here in this country. The boarding schools that I'm going to talk about, they primarily affected Native people, and they did not affect my family personally. So I'm not going to claim in any way that I speak for the students who went to these schools. The only information I can give you is what I can get out of historical research, which mostly means looking at written sources. And those sources, of course, were created mostly by elite white people. And the sources have gaps and they have biases and all of those things. So I just want to make it clear that while I'm trying to do my best to interpret history for this talk, I definitely do not have the same authority that Native people whose families attended these schools that they have. I'm only able to bring what I can bring as an historian. I also just want to say before we start that almost every time I've spoken to the public about these schools, someone in the audience does have that kind of authority. Like someone in the audience today probably either went to one of these schools or has family who went to one of these schools or knows someone who went to one of these schools. And so I just want to honor that and just recognize that the people who had the lived experiences are the ones with like the most authority to speak about it. I'm just giving you what I can as an historian. All right, so all that being said, I'm going to start the main part of the talk. So Last summer, some of you may have seen headlines like these. They were started to come out into the news about May of last year, almost exactly a year ago. May, June last year. Headlines that hundreds of unmarked graves of Native children were being discovered in Canada. The first articles that came out were about this school, Kamloops, which is up in British Columbia. It was run by the Catholic Church from 1890 to 1969. A lot of people are surprised to learn that these schools went on that long. Native families, of course, knew for quite a long time that children had gone into this school and had not come back. But the grave sites had not been marked, and the families sometimes didn't really know what had happened. And so what prompted the headlines was that the tribe that was most closely associated with Kamloops hired a researcher to do ground penetrating radar, which is this machine that you see on the screen here, to go over the suspected sites of graves and determine where there were graves. And this researcher found that there were about 200 unmarked graves of children at this one school in Canada. What is not so well known is that these schools weren't just in Canada, they were also in the United States, they were also in Oregon, and there are unmarked graves not far from where you all are in Lake Oswego. Okay, but before we get to talking about the graves, I'm going to provide some context on what these schools were. What were residential schools or boarding schools? Well, I think we all know the very basic storyline of what happened in the 19th century. So as the United States was growing in the 1800s, European Americans were pushing the borders of the country farther and farther west. They were taking over land and pushing out native tribes who had been living here since time immemorial. In Oregon and Washington, most of the tribes who lived in the Pacific Northwest were forced to sign treaties in the 1850s and 1860s. And these treaties removed them from their land. They had to move on to reservations. And this understandably was not something that the tribes were happy to accept. Some tribes refused to sign the treaties and instead resisted. Some tribes went to the reservations, sometimes under terrible circumstances. Some tribes rose up in resistance after treaty terms were broken. And there were times when settlers attacked Native peoples or tried to steal the lands that had been preserved by the treaties. So of course they fought back against all of these things. This led to a great number of wars between the US Army and other militias, like Oregon State Militia, against tribes in this area. In the Pacific Northwest, there were notable uprisings, including the Yakima War, the Rogue River Wars, the Modoc War, the Nez Perce War, the Bannock War, and more. Most of these happened between the 1850s and the 1870s. Actually going into the 1840s through the 1870s. So there was a sizable number of people at that time, white people, who thought, well, the best thing to do would be to either push all the Native people onto reservations and then basically just forget about them and let them die, or outright kill them. There are people who just thought, well, it'd be best to just exterminate this problem. Progressive reformers including some church leaders, some politicians, and some army officers argued for a different approach, which was instead of killing Native people outright, we would assimilate them. And this philosophy was summed up by this famous quote you see on the screen here. This is a quote by, it's actually a paraphrase of a quote from the founder of the federal boarding school system, this guy on the left, Richard Henry Pratt. It's kill the Indian, save the man. That basically means rather than actually like physically killing a person, you kill everything about their culture, so that you don't have the problem of the Indians anymore, because the Indians have been assimilated into white society. So the idea of assimilating the tribes through a system of schools, this got a lot of traction in the 1870s. Things that the supporters of this were claiming included that putting children in schools would end the Indian Wars. The schools would create new converts for the churches. And then this was a very important point. If you could teach all of the Native children who were on reservations to become farmers or tradesmen, then they wouldn't need the reservations anymore. And you could split up the reservation land, give a little bit of it to the Native people, but then the remainder, the so-called excess land on the reservations, could be privatized and given away to white settlers or interests like mining interests or timber interests. So this was a really big, follow the money. This was a really big point in favor of the schools at that time. And then finally, by training students to take on usually low wage professions, you kind of expand this workforce. So the system of creating schools where you could forcibly assimilate Native children, it started on the reservations here in the Pacific Northwest. The idea actually goes back quite a long time, but I'm just going to focus on a little more narrowly on Oregon and Washington. So in Oregon and Washington, the idea of putting Native children into boarding schools started on the reservation. So this is an example of, the school that was at Puyallup. And here's a picture of inside the school at Umatilla. And here's a picture of students from Grand Ronde, which is, by the way, this is where most of the families who were taken away from where Lake Oswego is, most of them would have been sent to Grand Ronde. So this picture shows children from Grand Ronde at an outing. So these reservation schools started 1860s, 1870s. But the on-reservation schools had a problem from the point of view of the school administrators, which was that the students were really close to their families. So like at Grand Ronde, let's just use this as an example. At Grand Ronde, the Catholic Church is what started the first schools on the reservation. So at first they had a day school, so a school that kids would just go to during the day, and they could be taught English and reading and writing and Catholicism and all the things that they wanted to instill in the children. The problem was that at the end of the day, they were walking home to their families. And so they were going from the assimilationist program of the school home to where they were learning, hearing their native language and being exposed to native cultural practices and all that. So that was a negative as far as the schools were concerned. So they kind of upped the ante and they changed a lot of the day schools on the reservations into boarding schools. So that way they could have more control over what the children were doing. They're no longer allowed to go home to their families, even though their families might only live like a mile or two away. They had to stay in the boarding school on the reservation under the nuns. But even that was not enough control. And so by the late 1870s, that was when the guy who said, "Kill the Indian, save the man," he said, we should do a more, like a bigger system with an even bigger goal. So the federal boarding school system was founded in 1879. And the idea behind the federal system was to take children off reservations and move them hundreds or even thousands of miles away to centralized, large boarding schools that could take children from dozens of tribes. These were very hard to run away from, and the children would be mixed with children from all different other tribes, so they wouldn't have anybody who they could speak their home language with. So this was a very kind of extreme idea about how to assimilate children. The federal off-reservation system eventually created 25 schools across the United States. The first one was in Pennsylvania. Look at where number 2 is. Number 2 was in Forest Grove, Oregon, which is where I live. So just about 20 miles west of Portland. Eventually, at least 367 of these schools were created across the United States. Some of them run directly by the federal government, some of them off reservation, some of them on reservation, and then a pretty large number run by Christian denominations. You can see listed over there on the right. What these schools did to the children is really heartbreaking. The children were being taught that basically everything about their home cultures was wrong and needed to be discarded. The system went on for generations. So it started in 1879, but the program of assimilation continued through the 1960s or 70s. So there's a lot of people still living today who went to these schools when they were still following that goal. It did a lot of cultural harm to tribes to have children taken away generation after generation. There was the direct harm of abuse and trauma. A lot of the children who attended these schools, encountered outright physical abuse, sexual abuse. But even if they had not, just the trauma of being forcibly taken away from your family at an age that could be as young as 5 or 6 years old, and barely getting to see your parents for years. This alone, of course, was extremely harmful. If you can imagine all of the children in your community being taken off to some other place where they were going to be told that, they couldn't speak your language, practice your religion, do any of those things. Those were all, I don't know if I need to belabor the point. It's basically super harmful to have this happen, let alone to one family, but to an entire tribe. Terrible. On top of this, many children died in these schools. The total number was never accounted for by the government, even to this day. We don't have a count of how many children died in these schools. So tribes have been calling for accountability on this for a long time. But for many, many years, there was really nobody in the federal government who was taking action. We now have a Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, who is Native and whose family was personally touched by these schools. I believe her grandparents were taken to one of these schools. And so about a year ago, soon after the news about the Kamloops school and the graves there came out, she made a call for accountability where the Department of the Interior would begin an investigation, and you can see the text of what it called for over on the right. This was a year ago when she called for this, and just recently in May, the first report of the commission that she established came out. So if you are interested in reading it, that is now there. It's a huge step forward, even though having read the report, my feeling is that it mostly highlighted how much work has yet to be done. It's going to be a lot of work to actually find out how many children disappeared into these schools and where their remains are today. So I have more slides, but before we get to them, I believe we're going to break and do a breakout discussion. And I'll announce the discussion topic, and then I'm actually not sure who is taking over to start the breakout rooms, but let me put the slide up. So the discussion here that we're suggesting are, the question is, were schools like these genocide? And if you think you know the answer, whether it's yes or no, go a little farther than yes or no and try to think like, if yes, if these schools were genocide, does that change how we should be learning about them, doing something about them? If the answer you think is no, that that's not quite the right term, what do you think would be a good way to describe it? Is there another way that would be better? We were hoping that the facilitators might be able to share, if they want to, maybe one thing interesting that came out of their group. We do ask that facilitators keep their comments to a minute or less, just because we have so many facilitators. And so if any facilitators would like to speak, you can unmute yourself and start.
I'll start. My name is Ed, and we had a very good discussion, and we were a little bit confused about the concept of a genocide, and if this really was genocide, because, you know, all the people, everybody hadn't been killed. I mean, so it was a little different kind of look, but we all agreed that actually, I think, anybody can step in, that actually it is, because it was, its effort was to destroy the culture, and destroy the culture through its children. Because if you destroy the culture and the children, the culture doesn't go on, because the old people die, the children. And I think when we also thought it was very purposeful activity. It was on purpose that this was done, and its purpose was to destroy the culture and just destroy its values and its history and its language. And so in that respect, it's genocide.
I can speak for a group, if that's all right. Also a very lively discussion, and right off the bat, it seemed that our group all felt that yes, it was genocide. It was intentional. And you look at the intent and the effect. The intent was to control a population, to eliminate a culture, and to affect the numbers. And by taking the children, by killing all the buffalo, in many ways, removing the language. Yes, the intent and the effect was towards genocide. Oh, and also rather amazed, miraculously amazed, as one person put it, that Native numbers are perhaps as high as they are, considering the intent of our government.
Mhm.
I'm Jan. I can go next. Our same themes here that we talked about how there's unfortunately so many different kinds of genocide, and that this really included the, mental harm and serious bodily harm, all kinds of genocide. And another really good discussion point was talking about how most white people haven't heard about this very much. And when and if we did, it was always in the light of, oh, we were trying to help these poor unfortunate people, these poor unfortunate uneducated people. So we took them to these schools and educated them. Aren't we good people? It's just horrific. Yeah.
I can go next. We had an excellent, lively discussion, and I want to thank all the people in my group. One of our members had looked up the definition of genocide, the United Nations definition, and definitely it was genocide, destroying a group, the mental abuse, the force that was used. There was all the parts of it. It fit right into that. And I just circled this one. It killed the spirit. That was a big one. So definitely it was genocide. And we talked a lot about, yes, it's complicated and it's complicated to address, but we did come away feeling a little hopeful. At this point in our country, it's slow, but there are things happening that are trying to address this. It won't bring all those people back, but hopefully going forward, we can do better.
I can speak for our group. Terry was our facilitator, but we agreed also. She read the UN definition for us also, and we agreed for sure that it was genocide. And the part we talked about too was how often when it's talked about in the past, when in fact it's still going on today. And there's still so many ways that the culture is attempted to be destroyed. And so that part of what we need to do is just continue to acknowledge it and bring it to light and educate ourselves. And we also talked about, the impact of generational trauma. And so thinking now, well, what would generational healing look like? And who's responsible? And really, we talked about how all of us, it has to come from all angles. It has to come from individual citizens, from churches, from schools, from universities, from the government, and kind of all angles, but that we're all responsible. That once we know, we have to do something about it.
I'd be happy to chime in for our group. We had a lively discussion. It was great. And I think the consensus was genocide plus, right? That there needed to be another word that included the ripple effect. Our group really held some space for the ripple effect intergenerationally, intergenerational trauma, and the ripple effect. If you look at, suicide rates, and so that the genocide didn't even was a part of it, but didn't cover the scale of horrificness. So, yeah. Thanks.
Did we have any other facilitators who wanted to comment?
Yeah, our group also discussed the meaning of genocide and cultural genocide. We discussed the deliberate killing of Native Americans, the forced conversions, and a lot of what you guys have already mentioned, our group talked about as well. Karen Sykes' husband lived in Pendleton, and he kind of chimed in and with his personal experience living in a town where there was a large Native American population. So that was interesting. And I think Karen posted the name of a book that he recommended. It's in the chat.
Yes, and our group discussed essentially everything. There was a lot to discuss. So we did agree that it was genocide. We looked it up and fit all definitions. And I think the one thing that we pointed up that hasn't been mentioned is the incredible resilience of the Native American people. So I did want to mention that.
And then our group also had looked it up as well. And so I think you all had gone over the definition. I think what was, as we kind of looked at the definition, you know, the word of genocide was made after the Holocaust. So it really didn't exist before that. So we found that very interesting. But yes, it was genocide. Even though people may thought it was a good or bad thing, just for the need of the land and whatever religious motivation there was. And in fact, I think at the end, had more questions that we hope that Ava will address in the second half.
I'm sure I won't be able to address everything, but.
Thank you.
So I was designated to represent our group. I think we came to many of the same conclusions as we've heard already. Technically, genocide implies intentional murder, and there was plenty of that for Native Americans, but at the schools the deaths were maybe well-intentioned, but not directly murder, just based on the lack of value for the children there. So we came up with a different term, which I've heard before now, a cultural genocide. It was an attempt specifically to wipe out the culture, and is no less horrible than regular genocide. One other thing that came up, Pam suggested a book called Murder at the Mission, which she recommended to give further insight into some of these things.
Yes. Am I missing anybody? I don't have all the facilitators' names, so I'm not sure if we're missing anyone else who wanted to speak who's a facilitator. Well, that was very interesting to hear that range of responses, and also just to hear how many groups ended up looking up the definition of genocide. And, you know, the main one that you'll find on the internet is the legal definition from the UN, which includes like 5 different types or categories of things that can be considered genocide. And one of them is forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So under that definition, it does appear to fit the UN definition of genocide. But of course, that's not the only definition out there. So we're going to have more time for question and discussions at the end, but now I'm going to impose on you another set of slides. So bear with me for just a moment while I reopen that. Just one moment. All right, so in our part 1, I was talking mostly about kind of the general big picture of what happened with these schools, a little bit about what happened in Oregon, but mostly about kind of the big picture. And so now I'm going to zoom in a bit. to the two schools that I've been researching the most closely, which are the Forest Grove Indian School in Chimawa. These two pictures, I think one of these two was used in the advertisement for this talk. These are the two best known photos relating to the school, and what they're a picture of is the same group of children who were taken to the Forest Grove Indian School, which was the second off-reservation federal boarding school in the United States, opened in 1880. So on the left, you see a group of children from the Spokane tribe as they were entering the Forest Grove Indian School. And then on the right, you can see the caption's really small, but the caption says, "New recruits, Spokane Indians after 7 months at school." And so this pair of photos is like a before and after that was supposed to illustrate to mostly a white audience what the school was doing. And, you know, you can just see what they were doing. They were assimilating the children, forcing them to, you know, wear their hair like white people, to wear Western clothes, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that you may notice, though, in looking at this pair of photos is that between the two photos, there's a different number of children. There's one girl who is missing from the second photograph, and the missing child her name was Martha Lott. She was the daughter of the chief of the tribe. And we probably know more about the circumstances of Martha Lott's death than we do about almost any other child who attended the Forest Grove Indian School or Chimawa. We know about it because the superintendent of the school wrote letters to her father explaining what was going on and explaining after she had died. And copies of those letters are still in the National Archives, so we know quite a bit about the circumstances of her death. She was sick with an illness that was described as a sore on her side. Oh, we think that she's probably the girl who's the tallest, the one in the middle, on top middle on the left. She was sick with what was described as a sore on her side, which might have been some sort of abscess or infection, which then progressed, and then she passed away. She was the very first child who died in custody of this school. This happened hundreds of miles away from her parents. They didn't know what had happened to her until weeks later when the message got back to them. Her remains were buried in Forest Grove, about a mile from where I'm sitting right now. Her grave to this day has no marker on it. It's in the town cemetery, but there's no marker. And it's for families of children like Martha Lott that a lot of the work I'm going to describe to you, I feel like is for. So what is this school, Forest Grove Indian School? Forest Grove was, as we saw on that map back in the first section, that was the second off-reservation federal boarding school in the entire United States. This is the best picture we have of what it looked like. And how I got involved in researching the history of the school is that I'm the archivist at Pacific University, which is also in Forest Grove. When I came to Pacific in 2011, I didn't know very much about the boarding school system or about this school in particular. And I've put a lot of work into uncovering and sharing information about what happened at the school, as well as how Pacific University, my employer, how they were involved. But when I first moved here to Oregon in 2011, At Pacific, we didn't really know much about what this school was all about. We knew like the really broad strokes, like we knew that it had opened in 1880. We knew that it was being run by the federal government with some kind of cooperation from the university. We knew it was located off campus. And we knew that in 1885, the school moved north of Salem and was renamed Chimawa. So if you're driving down I-5 towards Salem, you'll see on one of the freeway exits, it says Chimawa, and that's where the school was and is. It's actually still open today, although today it's a very different place. It no longer, for decades, it has not had the goal of assimilation, but it is still open. But basically, 10 years ago at Pacific, we didn't really know a whole lot about the history of the school. And this began to change after I met Shauna Hotch. She's the woman who's on the left-hand side of this picture. She was a student at Pacific back around 2012, 2013. One day I was working on an exhibit in Pacific's library, and she came up and introduced herself, and she said that she had just graduated from Chimawa and that she knew that Chimawa had originally been the Forest Grove Indian School. And she was interested in doing a service project to clean up the graves of children who had died in Forest Grove. And because she had done something, from what I recall, she had done something similar at Chimawa when she was a student there. So, when she said this, that she wanted to clean up the graves of the children who had gone to the Forest Grove Indian School, I was like, well, this is really terrible because we don't know at that time. We didn't know how many children had died, who they were, where they were buried. We didn't know anything. I was like, we actually have no idea where these children might be buried. So I hired Shauna to work in the archives. And together, our first step in tackling this problem was to create some detailed documentation about who the students at the school even were. That was like kind of the basic level of research that we needed to do. So we had a copy of one of the school's rosters, and we started out by just writing down names, like writing down names of students who went to the school. We wrote down their names, what their tribal affiliation was, what their birth date was, their death date, if we knew it, and any other information we could find out about their time at the school. We found that during the 5 years that the school was open in Forest Grove, there were 310 students taken to it. They came from about 24 modern tribal nations across Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Alaska. And anyway, a large number of students just during those 5 years. Part of this project too, we scanned every document and photo we could find in the archives where I worked relating to the school. We put them all online, and this is work that is like still continuing to this day. But by the time that Shauna left Pacific, we still hadn't resolved exactly how many children died there, or why they died, or where they were buried. It takes actually like a lot of research to figure out the answers to those questions. Finding information about deaths at the school has been really difficult because school officials didn't keep good records always about when students died, and they kept even less clear records of where the children were buried. In the case of Martha Lott, whose pictures we saw, we had a lot of documentation of her death, but at first we had nothing about where she was buried. But eventually we found enough evidence, including this here. This is a copy of one of the cemetery's old logbooks, and it shows that Martha Lott was buried in this one particular grave. near another student from the school whose name is over on the right-hand side. And so we did find where they were buried, but they're buried in graves in the cemetery, but with there's no headstone, there's no marker. One of the best sources about deaths and burials at the school has turned out to be the school's financial ledgers. And so again, you follow the money, and anything that was outside of these schools' normal budgets had to be accounted for with the federal government. So if you had an unexpected expense, you had to turn in like a reimbursement form effectively. And so we can find evidence of when they were buried. And so this ledger, which you can see has been like almost ruined by water, is in the National Archives branch in Seattle. And it shows the funeral expenses for Martha Lott. Funeral expense, Indian girl, pupil, Martha Lott. So this is the sort of thing that we're looking at in order to document the evidence. We've been consulting with a large body of evidence, everything from diaries, letters, newspapers, the official school records, anything we can find that talks about deaths or burials at the school. And so the summary of what we found for just that 5-year period in Forest Grove is that there were 11 or 12 student deaths during that time period. Most of them were from tuberculosis. And you can see where the burials are. 2 are still in unmarked graves in our local cemetery. Some were taken home by their families, and several are still unaccounted for. But that was just for the 5 years that the school was in Forest Grove. Since 1885, the school has been north of Salem, so much more time. When the school transferred to Chimawa in 1885, the conditions there were initially really poor. The students first moved there with no buildings. They moved to Chimawa. There was nowhere for them to sleep. So the students were put to work building their own dormitories, which in the first year were nothing more than shacks. And the government's own inspectors who visited during this time period were absolutely shocked and appalled by what was going on. They reported that the shacks were leaking from every direction, that the children were walking around in ankle-deep mud, that they were covered in lice. They were packing in a lot of children into these very crowded conditions. And so it's not very surprising that while 11 children died in Forest Grove, within the first 5 years at Chimawa, 41 children died. It was around 10 to 15% of the children who were enrolling at the school were dying, which was a really high number. I gotta say, this is, sometimes people, when I give these talks, one of the questions I get is, well, didn't people just die more? Like, weren't there a lot of, wasn't there like really high child mortality at that time? And yes, child mortality was higher, but these kind of rates, if this had been happening at a place like Pacific University, where I work at that time, parents would not have been keeping their, they wouldn't have been sending their children to Pacific if they knew that there was like a 15% chance of them dying. The physical conditions at Chimawa improved over time, but the school got, even though the physical plant got better, the institutional character got worse over the following decades. I've spoken with descendants of alumni who attended in the 1920s, and that was, the 20s was the height of the system, a time when about 80% of Native American children were being put in these institutions. And the families say that for some kids, this was a real hell. Like they didn't have enough blankets. They didn't have enough food. Infections were spreading easily. All the children were living together and eating together. You know, it was not good conditions. During the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918, 23 students died in 2 months. Now, for all these children who died at Chimawa between 1885 and the late 1930s, the default was to bury them in this cemetery, the Chimawa Cemetery. If the families could afford to transport remains back home, they would be sent home, but otherwise they would be buried here. I just want to say at this point that I keep saying we, and that's because I'm not the only one involved in this work. And one of the people I've been working with is Sue Ann Reddick, who's pictured here. She's been researching the history of Chimawa for over 20 years. And we realized about 5 years ago that we were doing a lot of like parallel research. We spoke on a panel together at a conference of the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition a couple of years ago, and we've been keeping each other up to date on our work. So anyway, Sue Ann is one of the few people who's actually published something on the history of these schools in Oregon. And so when all the news came out last year about unmarked graves in Kamloops, Sue Ann and then I started getting a lot of calls from the press basically saying, we know you've been researching this, and what's the story here in Oregon? There has been suspicion about the existence of unmarked graves at Chimawa for quite a long time. If you visit the Chimawa Cemetery, you notice it's kind of peculiar. Although the burials date from like a 50-year period, all of the burials from before 1960 have matching metal burial plates. Like, that seems really weird, right? That a burial in 1890 would have exactly the same marker as one from 1925. And there are strange kind of blank areas within the rows of the cemetery where there's no markers. And so one Native researcher named Marcia Small, who's pictured here, she has been undertaking ground penetrating radar studies at Chimawa for quite a few years now. And she's reportedly found many possible unmarked grave sites at Chimawa. But Sue Ann and I were concerned about how all this might get reported in the press. We are concerned that, for example, if the Statesman Journal were to just take a site like Find a Grave and list how many students had died based on that list, they would be really understating the number of deaths that actually occurred at the school. And we were also concerned that speculation might overstate the number of deaths or really kind of, incorrectly report what was really going on, which could bring a lot of unintended pain to Native families. So we didn't think that there were hundreds of unmarked graves at Chimawa. We thought there might be dozens. And so, and we had a lot of name and date corrections to put out there. And so we ended up taking our many years of research, and after consulting with some of our friends in Native communities, we decided to publish what we did know, all of which, came from sources that we were able to find in the public record of how many students died, what they died of, and where we thought they might be buried. And we didn't do it in a vacuum. I just want to state too that Sue Ann has been connected to the Chimawa community since the 1990s. She worked there as she worked on a landscaping project there years ago and then became a volunteer. And she has friends in their alumni network in Oregon and Washington and Alaska. And so anyway, we were checking in with folks along the way. And what we ultimately did was last fall, we published this website that provides what we think are the correct names, death dates, tribal affiliations, and when possible, burial locations of the students who attended the Forest Grove and Chimawa schools. And there on the bottom of the screen, you can see kind of the summary of the information. So at least 270 children died in custody of these schools. About 175 of them were buried at Chimawa. There's about 50 students whose remains are still unaccounted for. One of the outcomes of this, though, was that, you know, I said there were like sections of the cemetery, rows, where it just looked like there was nothing there. Well, we think that these sections that have nothing there, supposedly, are actually unmarked graves. And the dates that those unmarked graves are in, we have names of students who died during those dates. And so there is some hope that we might be able to help match up names with unmarked graves. And I won't read this whole slide, but this research also resulted in kind of doing some what we think are pretty good explanations for why the Chimawa Cemetery ended up the way that it is today. So I've been kind of telling you this in a pretty factual manner, I think, as I go through this, trying to explain, you know, what the research was and what the numbers are and the sources of information and all that. But I just want to kind of stop and acknowledge at this point that this is, you know, it's not numbers, it's not just dry facts. Every child on these spreadsheets was a real child with a real family. And so this is difficult work to do. There are, you know, like I said, a lot of the children who died, I'd say the majority died from diseases like tuberculosis or Spanish flu. But there were also many stories of children who died running away. In the 20s and 30s, there were a lot of children who tried to run. Like there was one child who tried to hop on a freight train and was crushed. There was another who was stealing food to have something to eat and was shot by a storekeeper. There was another who tried to swim across, I think, the Willamette River and drowned. And I think these stories really underscore how these deaths aren't just something that happened, like just something that was kind of a sign of the times or something like that. It wasn't inevitable, it wasn't fate. Children were dying in terrible circumstances that were imposed by the state. Anyway, I just wanted to kind of comment on that human aspect to this story. So I just gave an account of how we published this website, and another kind of side comment is that many news outlets have been taking up this story of children in residential schools and deaths at Chimawa, and it's it's nice as an historian, I have to say, as an historian, usually no one really cares what you're doing. And in this case, people really do care. They care a lot, which is great. But, we aren't doing the work for that recognition. We're doing it because the families deserve to know what happened. And I'm hopeful that the media picking up this story won't be just something that, the news cycle is done now and then no one cares. We hope that people continue to do the work to help heal from this whole experience. Okay. So I understand you all usually do a call to action, and I usually do one in my talks anyway. So you're going to get my my calls to action here. First, though, I want to say the usual, actually, what I used to think was the call to action, we can't do. When I say we, I mean like we us non-tribal people, we can't do it. Decisions about what happens with the unmarked graves need to be done by the tribes. And so, as much as we might want to just go out to the cemetery in Forest Grove and place a marker there, that needs to be the decision of the tribes. And that decision has already been handed to the tribes. We have a group in Forest Grove that's ready and willing to facilitate whatever they do decide to do. So for actions that we can do, there's a lot of ways that we as individuals can support Native sovereignty and treaty rights. So that can be anything from like supporting fishing rights of Native tribes to, a whole host of other things. I won't ramble on about this, but just one little example is that my parents live in California, very near a reservation, and they were very upset when the local tribe there decided to place a casino on their land. And, they're not racist people. And I like to think they support Native Americans, but they were like, well, this tribe, are they a real tribe? Are they just doing this to make money? They had a lot of thoughts like that. And I think, in a case like that, we have to really realize that they are real. Tribes are real. They get to make decisions as sovereign governments. And whether we agree with particular decisions or not, it's a good practice to back up the fact that they are sovereign and that they have the right to make those decisions. Another way that we can support Native people is to support Native culture. And that can be anything from, buying things from Native artists, enrolled tribal members. This can be attending Native cultural events that are open to the public. This can be visiting the cultural center of the tribe where you live. So for those of you who are in Grand Ronde's traditional lands, that would be the Chichalu Museum, pretty close to Spirit Mountain Casino. There's a lot of ways that you can do this. And this actually directly opposes the aims of the schools. The schools were aiming to wipe out culture. And so if we can uplift and support Native culture, that's actually a direct opposition to the school's aims. And then, of course, if you would like to donate, two organizations that I would recommend are the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, which is a Native-led organization that works on healing for survivors and their families. And then more locally, the Native American Youth and Family Center in Portland. They're doing great work on doing Native-centered education for local tribal people. And with that, that's all the slides that I have. And so at this point, I think we can open up for chat. And if any of you, just so you know, I haven't had chat open most of the time that I've been talking. And so if you put anything in chat already or sent me a direct message, I probably haven't seen it. And we're going to have one of our facilitators is going to moderate.
We'll see how I do with this. Multitasking. I wonder, Eva, if you want to say anything about the Supreme Court case that was referenced in the chat, relating to, I think, the Indian Welfare Act. And if not, that's fine.
All right, I'm not familiar with the Supreme Court case. I am thinking, and please correct me, the person who put this in chat, if I'm wrong, that this is relating to adoptions and foster care situation for Native Americans currently. Is that correct?
Nancy, do you want to chime in, or?
Yes, that's absolutely correct. And it was something I was totally unaware of. And, you know, it's not really targeting, they're targeting that so they can start to disseminate then a lot of Native and sovereign rights. So it's the tip of the iceberg. So I think people really need to get on board and pay attention to what's happening and why they're doing it. You know, if they can start taxing federal indigenous land, you know, it's follow the money again. So I really recommend people listen to This Land podcast season 2. It'll explain the whole situation. It's very good.
Yeah, so this is definitely outside of my area of expertise, but just what I've heard is that around the time that the residential school system started winding down, its assimilationist policies, the practice of putting Native children into foster care and then adopting them out to white families really ramped up. And there was a point when some outrageous number of children on reservations were being placed in foster care. I don't have the percentage in front of me, but it was a really shocking amount. You know, I want to say like 40% or so. It was some huge amount of children. And so like the system of placing children in white care sort of transitioned at one point from being into these schools to being into the foster care system. And so that's a really big continuing concern for tribes.
Thank you. If this is too personal of a question, we can move on, but I'm curious about your self-care practices, because this is very emotionally taxing work.
Yeah. Okay, so I first want to say that this is a difficult question because I don't want to in any way imply that, like, you know, what I go through third hand as a researcher compares in any way to what Native families went through. It doesn't. That being said, it is not easy, I have to say, to spend months looking at these spreadsheets of children dying. You know, it's hard work. And I've been thinking a lot about that because I've been writing a book on the history of the Forest Grove Indian School for years now, and it's actually really hard for me to finish it because every time I start working on it now, it's like it's just hard. It's like I imagine, I don't know that this is true, but I imagine that it might be similar to what a therapist who has to talk to a lot of people who have been through trauma may go through, that like at some point that trauma kind of enters your own life to some extent. So anyway, I guess I'm trying to be mindful about it without making it be about me as much as I can.
Yeah. What are your What are the plans sort of into the future if you look out 5 or 10 years with respect to the research going on and how we can either honor or make reparations?
Well, as far as the research, there's a huge amount of work to be done. So there have been, like, historians have been writing books about these schools for not that long, probably about 20 or 30 years is when how long kind of the field of historical work has been going on. So there's still a huge amount to be done. Like, there have been no books on the Forest Grove Indian School, for example, but all of the on-reservation boarding schools, almost every reservation in the Pacific Northwest had a boarding school, and next to nothing has been published about any of them. And then there's the question of, you know, the deaths and the graves. And we did a lot of that work just for Chimawa and Forest Grove, but there are how many, 300 and something schools, and that type of work, the kind of really granular, like looking at names and specific dates, and that needs to be done for hundreds of schools. So I think it's going to be like decades of work, realistically. Yeah.
Is there support for the work?
So with the current commission that Secretary of the Interior has formed, there is now this kind of formal government structure, and they've put out some plans for how they plan to do it, which includes having mostly Native researchers doing the work, which is very appropriate, and paying a lot of attention to the privacy of records, all of those things. So there is some kind of structure around that, but it's part of that's part of the Department of the Interior, which is, the executive branch of the government. And so if we have a change in parties, there will be a complete change in who's in charge at the Department of the Interior. And so that work could really come to a halt at any time if we have a new election. So there is structure, I guess I'm saying, but that government support may not be there forever.
Yeah. And how about with respect to the Forest Grove community and Pacific University? How's the research received and supported?
There's been a lot of, I would say, support and interest locally at Pacific, both at the university and in the local community for the most part. So I got to say, like, when you hold a talk or put out a video or whatever, the people who are going to watch and participate are often the people who are already sort of interested, So I don't know if we were to poll the entire community, there'd still be a lot of people who would not know anything about it. But like just within Pacific, there's actually been, I would say, a lot of support from students and faculty and the administration, actually, for like uncovering more and like being more open about what happened and giving more transparency to it.
And one of the things that maybe you could touch on is the role of churches and missionaries in the off-reservation schools.
Yeah, so big question. And we could do a whole lecture on that topic. Okay, I'm going to try not to be long-winded about this, but churches are really, really wrapped up in this whole story. I focused a lot on the government here, but churches are actually really implicated. And how this got started is that back in the 19th century, under President Grant, he assigned each Indian reservation to have a liaison with a church. If that makes sense. So like each reservation had an official kind of church denomination contact that was working with them So like Grand Ronde was Catholic. Umatilla was Catholic. Warm Springs, I think, was Presbyterian, and so on. And so every reservation had these missionaries who were like actually officially there, assigned by the government. And so they were often the ones who were starting the schools. And the missionaries at these reservations, began the on-reservation schools for the most part. And then once the federal off-reservation schools got going, they often had, at least at the beginning, some sort of church affiliation as well. So like in Forest Grove, the children were forced to attend the Congregational Church, which is now the United Church of Christ, the same church that it sounded like, sponsored your space or your, I didn't quite catch exactly what the connection was, but United Church of Christ was involved among many other denominations. And many churches now, I'll try not to be too long-winded, but just to wrap this up, many, but not all churches are now grappling with this. And so United Church of Christ, for example, has been working on first step, acknowledging that it happened and apologizing. But that can't be where it ends, right? There has to be not just saying you're sorry, but doing something about it. And so a lot of churches, but not all of them, are working on that currently.
Thank you. Pat, what's our timeline? Because it's 8:27. And you're on mute.
Just a couple more questions, please.
Pardon?
Just a couple more questions.
Sure. Are there any stories that have been written about from the children's point of view?
Yeah. So the school, I've been focusing mostly on the Forest Grove Indian School in my own research, which was, open from 1880 to 85. And so there are very few accounts in the words of the children themselves from that time period. But for other schools, there are many, many accounts. So like Chimawa, later periods of Chimawa, there are many accounts of children, and other schools, there are many accounts told from the point of view of children. And I'm going to get the titles wrong if I try to put them into chat right now, but yes, there are. And the stories are really powerful, but something else to kind of know about them is that individual experiences are very individual. So like there are some children who suffered horrific, abuse and neglect. There are other, like I've heard survivors of these schools speak, sometimes they actually had a pretty positive experience within the school that they went to for one reason or another. And so it is a very individual story for each student who went there.
One question is, can the math be done to come up with a number of excess deaths among the children at the schools versus what you would expect from a death rate among maybe white children?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really tricky question. So there's a researcher who's been working on that problem, who finished a dissertation recently on kind of like the public health history of the system in general. And so he's been trying to answer that question. I think it's actually extremely difficult to answer because we don't always know why the children died. And on top of that, there's a lot of really tricky questions when you're comparing any two groups of people, right? So like, if you're gonna compare like Native children within a particular school to a peer group of white children, well, is that the correct peer group? Like, should the peer group be a group of children on a reservation? Anyway, there's so many variables that it's pretty difficult to give like a really like statistically, I don't know what the word would be, statistically accurate, statistically valid count. But all that being said, I'm looking at, being the archivist at Pacific, I'm looking at children who were enrolled in we had in the 19th century at Pacifica high school and elementary school attached to us that boarded, children boarded in the local community. And just anecdotally, the number of children dying who went to Tualatin Academy was much less, much less. Yeah.
And maybe one other question. And I guess I'm not really sure how to ask it, but I'll just say, if students were removed from their homes, and if the children didn't know, that their families didn't have a choice in them being removed from their homes and sent to these schools, like how do, I guess maybe talk a little bit, if you know anything about sort of the family dynamics and of these students who maybe blame their parents or, didn't know who to blame or, didn't know.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of trauma to unpack there. Again, I think we do have to recognize that each of these students was an individual, and each of them came from, a family situation that could be very different than, student A could come from a very different background than student B. So like, just looking at that very early time period in the 1880s, some of the children who were taken to the school were like 18 or 19 years old, had a white father of high status, who's married to a Native woman, and they had been in a white school already for like 10 years before they were sent to Forest Grove. So for those students, I don't think the experience of being sent was super traumatic for those particular students. But for other students who were taken at age 5 or 6 and didn't speak any English and were really, separated from their parents at a very early age, I'm sure it was just awful. And I don't think the whole situation of the parents is very difficult, because I think that they were usually being told through a translator that basically they had to send their children. That like in later years, like in the 19-teens and 20s, the government could just show up and take children, like just grab them and take them. The early 1880s, they didn't yet have the direct power to do that exactly. The superintendent of the school had to do a little bit of more work to get like nominal consent, but I think it was definitely nominal in a lot of cases. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to let Pat take over now, but thank you so much, Eva.
I'm seeing so many questions that I wish we had been able to get to in the chat too. So.
Ava, thank you so much for sharing your work. And I know that you have much to share about many things and other topics as we have planned with you. So certainly we would love to invite you back again at another point in time. So do you have any last words? I know we're going to be posting in the chat all of your actions that we would want the community to do to support your efforts and for the Native Americans. So do you have anything that you want to say before we go into some announcements?
I'm just going to reiterate the two main calls to action. One is to support Native sovereignty in whatever way you want. And then the other is to support Native culture, living Native culture. And thank you again. I'm going to save the chat so I can read it more thoroughly.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, then we can plan our next another meeting. Well, thank you again, Ava. We learned so much tonight. As far as other announcements, thank you all for participating in some of the events that we have had in the city. We do have Juneteenth coming up on June 19th, so please attend that event. Celebration of ending slavery. And then also thank you all for who have applied for boards and commissions for Lake Oswego. Your input and participation is very, very helpful in making Lake Oswego a better place to live. And also another opportunity is there will be openings for city council. So please consider that, or if you have some people in mind who would be a good influence in this community, please have them apply. I believe that it closes at the end of this month. And thank you again, and you all have a good meeting. Thank you, Ava.